Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. Well, I like to start my points by remembering a date, the 7th of October 2006. That was the day when Anna was killed, Anna Politkovskaya. She died while Vladimir Putin was celebrating his birthday on that very day. I have to admit, at that time, I didn't know that much about her, what a great, courageous, investigative journalist she was. But I remember the moment I learned about her murder. It was an eye-opener. And that is the main point I want to make in these couple of minutes. The freedom of the press is not only a fundamental right in true democracies, it stands also for the freedom of the whole of society. Journalists are like seismographs. When there is a change, they are the early ones to feel it. Someone wants to build up an authoritarian regime, he will start with the media, before turning to all the others like judges, officers, members of parliament, artists, teachers, so on. Back to Anna Politkovskaya. When I learned about her murder, that was the moment I became aware of the darkness of the Russian state. Though she wasn't the first Russian journalist that had been killed, there were murders even before Vladimir Putin took power. However, the fate of Anna was the one that opened my eyes, but not wide enough. What I did not realize at that time was that the very darkness of the Russian state would ever have anything to do with me and with my work here in Germany. I perceived myself as a German journalist, happy and lucky to work in a free and safe democracy and covering struggles like in Russia from a distance. That was a mistake, a naivety, and yes, even worse, an ignorance. I had to learn that in 2014. Russia had annexed Crimea and was fighting in the east of Ukraine. We covered those events like we covered many other conflicts before. We were clear about who was the aggressor. But, looking back, I would say we were rather prudent, and we even swallowed the Russian framing of a separatist movement. Covering international conflicts in other parts of the world is our daily business and our news show. And usually the German public, to be honest, does not get extremely emotional about it. It is rather difficult to draw attention to such conflicts as long as they do not affect immediately German interests. The war in Georgia in 2008, for example, well, difficult to explain to a German audience. We did cover it, of course, we considered it being important, but there was no evidence that our audience was freaking out about it. Definitely nothing a regular German family would talk about at the dinner table. But in 2014, something was different. All of a sudden, there was that huge amount of negative comments online. At some point, we had even the impression that quite a large part of the German society was outraged about the way we covered these events, with accusations of being biased or even intentional lying about facts. One day, I received an email from some person I knew but had not been in contact for ages, and all of a sudden, that person would write me a text message and ask me if we are free in our reporting or if we are part of an anti-Russian propaganda system. I remember how baffled I was when receiving that text message. At that time, in 2014, I had worked in that anchorwoman job for almost 13 years, so you gain some experience. Never before I felt so much pressure. What was going on? I remember a conference, an editorial meeting, where we would talk about that and questioning ourselves. Are we doing mistakes? What's going on? And all of a sudden, one of my colleagues, a very bright one that I appreciate very much, would say, you know what? I think that is organized. It's orchestrated. And I would look at him and say, oh, come on, that sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory. Well, soon after, first reports were published about the so-called troll factory of St. Petersburg. And then, very slowly, we started to understand what was going on. That Russian language students who knew some German would be paid to write negative comments on German websites. We had to learn that such techniques of manipulation are part of a hybrid warfare, some word I didn't even know at that time. We became a bit less naive, but still, none of us would have anticipated the January 6th Capitol storm in Washington 2021. None of us would have anticipated such a dystopia becoming real. One of the oldest and, as we thought, strongest democracies being so outrageously endangered. I couldn't believe my eyes while we were covering it live. And yes, that was a moment when I, as a political journalist, became frightened. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. Or if they can make it there, they can make it everywhere. Who's they? Well, one of the leading figures in that development was former Trump advisor Steve Bannon. You might have seen that guy lately in handcuffs. What was a nice picture to see, but no reason to feel reassured. He was the one who said, "Flood the zone with shit." And this is what we witness each and every day. The zone, the internet, is flooded with shit. For us working in a newsroom, the biggest problem is just not about detecting shit and debunking it. We developed some skills in that regard. We know about forensic research and verification techniques. We mistrust, of course, sources we do not know. Mistakes happen, of course, but overall we came a long way from the naivety of the pre-2014 years. We learned, but the main problem, the core of the problem, is not about debunking single fake news or propaganda. The main problem is their possible impact on society, and this is what worries me most. And here I'd like to cite famous philosopher Hannah Arendt, who was such a fine analyst of totalitarian systems. She said, "In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached a point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing. A people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up his mind. It is deprived not only of the capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please." To spread that kind of doubt in society is like instilling poison. Well, yes, fake news are part of that trouble. Lately, we had links to news sites faking to be reliable sources, like the German public broadcaster news show Tagesschau, or a serious news magazine like The Spiegel. So there are lookalike websites ready to fool the audience, with headlines, for example, pretending that there had been a school blown up because of energy savings. Yes, there was an explosion taking place at a German school, but it has nothing to do with energy-saving politics in the aftermath of the Russian war. But the main problem is not about debunking all that kind of fake news. The main problem is debunking the allegation that you yourselves, that we are fake news. This is what Donald Trump would scream in the faces of independent journalists. You are fake news. And you are the enemy of the people. A fascist framing, the first time I heard him saying it would raise the hair on the back of my neck. So summing up, what are the three main challenges we are faced with? What are the main threats to the freedom of press and freedom of society as a whole? First, we have, as I noted, the zone flooded with fakes and propaganda. There are commercial interests, of course, clickbaiting, advertisement, etc. But there's also a political intention behind it. The way Hannah Arendt described it, make people nervous, unsettle them, defame reliable sources, call them mainstream media, thereby framing that the media would be a monolithic block, call them fake news to undermine their credibility. Second, we have old school repressions like censorship in Russia or China, critical voices being silenced, dragged before court, put in prison, tortured, or even killed. This does not only happen in dictatorships, though. It horrified me to learn that murders also happen in member states of the European Union. A female investigative journalist blown up in her car on the island of Malta. A young journalist and his fiancée executed at home in Slovakia. Both of them were investigative journalists covering corruption topics related to the government. But there have been also murders not related to state interference. Lately, an investigative journalist was killed in Rotterdam, probably by the mob because he was investigating mafia business. And here in Germany, we have a new phenomenon that we are intimidated and menaced by groups of society, like some of my colleagues, when covering protests of so-called worried citizens, need security protection. That is new, and this is something I think citizens should worry about. But there is one third point I want to make before finishing. When talking about press freedom, some years ago I met a colleague in Bolivia, in La Paz, and he's the chief editor, he was the chief editor of a newspaper. And he said to me, you know, in the beginning, the government would yell at us and defame us, drag us in court and so on. Nowadays, they have become much smarter and more subtle. Now they are simply buying us. And this is a big, big topic. We will talk about it later. And it happens not only in Bolivia, of course, but all over the planet. Who is financing media and why? Follow the money. So let me make last point here. Commercial structure is by no means a warranty for being free of state interference or being remote from political influence or interests or ideology. In some cases, we even witnessed here in Europe how the owner of the biggest media companies became a prime minister. So journalism is not a protected title. Anyone can tell himself or herself a journalist. And yes, there is bad journalism, and there are journalists who are rather activists or business people. And sometimes, we have stupidity, we have bad reporting, defamation, even that what we call bullshit journalism. But as long as you find independent, serious media in your country, look at them. Do they feel free and secure, or is there an unease? You do not necessarily have to admire journalists. Yes, question us, criticize us, but at the very end of the day, journalists are the best early warners, the best early warning system you have when you are interested in the state of your society and its political system. Thank you.